The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval training facility as Sarah Martinez adjusted her gear one final time. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking each piece of equipment with the methodical care that had kept her alive through countless missions. The irony wasn't lost on her that after surviving some of the most dangerous operations in modern warfare, she was about to face what might be her greatest challenge yet. As a Navy SEAL with 8 years of combat experience, Sarah had earned her place among the military's elite. She had parachuted into hostile territory, conducted underwater demolitions, and led rescue operations that others deemed impossible. Her service record was classified at the highest levels, known only to a select few who understood the true cost of freedom. But today, all of that meant nothing. Today, she was just another recruit, starting basic training. The decision to go undercover hadn't been easy. Military intelligence had received disturbing reports about systemic issues within the training program at Naval Station Great Lakes. Allegations of hazing, discrimination, and abuse of power had reached the highest levels of command. Traditional investigations had yielded nothing concrete, as the perpetrators were skilled at covering their tracks when official inspectors arrived. Sarah had volunteered for the assignment when other options were exhausted. Her superiors needed someone who could blend in completely, someone who could endure whatever the training threw at her while gathering evidence. Most importantly, they needed someone who wouldn't break under pressure, no matter how intense things became. The cover story was perfect in its simplicity. Sarah Martinez would become Sarah Williams, a college dropout from a small town in Ohio who had enlisted after struggling to find direction in civilian life. Her military records had been temporarily sealed and replaced with fabricated documents showing no prior service. To everyone at the training facility, she would appear to be just another young woman hoping to prove herself worthy of serving her country. Walking toward the processing center, Sarah observed the other recruits arriving for the new training cycle. Most looked nervous but excited, carrying duffel bags and wearing expressions of determined optimism. A few had the swagger of those who believed military service would be an easy path to respect and benefits. None of them could imagine that the quiet woman walking among them had already earned more combat decorations than most career soldiers. The processing began with the usual bureaucratic efficiency of military induction. Sarah moved through each station, submitting to medical examinations, completing paperwork, and receiving her assigned gear. She kept her responses brief and unremarkable, playing the role of someone overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was undertaking. Her bunkmate assignment came as a relief. Rebecca Chen was a genuinely enthusiastic recruit from California who had joined to follow in her father's footsteps. The young woman's earnest desire to serve reminded Sarah why she had originally enlisted years ago, before the weight of classified missions and the reality of modern warfare had changed her perspective on military service. The first week passed in a blur of orientation sessions, uniform fittings, and basic administrative tasks. Sarah observed everything with the trained eye of someone who understood how institutions really functioned. She noted which drill instructors seemed genuinely committed to developing strong sailors and which appeared more interested in exercising power over vulnerable recruits. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb fell decidedly into the latter category. A career instructor who had never seen combat deployment, Webb had built his reputation on breaking down recruits through psychological intimidation rather than constructive training. His approach was technically within regulations, but barely, and he seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting those he perceived as weak or different. During the first formal inspection, Sarah watched Webb work his way down the line of recruits. His criticisms were harsh but fair until he reached Amanda Rodriguez, a soft-spoken young woman from Texas who had joined to escape an abusive family situation. Webb's assessment of her uniform became unnecessarily personal, his comments designed to humiliate rather than correct. Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she watched the exchange. Every instinct told her to intervene, to put Webb in his place with the authority her real rank commanded. But maintaining her cover was essential. She forced herself to remain at attention, filing away every detail for her eventual report. The hazing began subtly. Extra duties assigned to certain recruits for minor infractions that others were allowed to slide. Random room inspections that somehow always targeted the same bunks. Training exercises where specific individuals found themselves isolated or unsupported by their instructors. Sarah found herself increasingly included in Webb's target list, though she couldn't initially determine why. Her performance was deliberately average, designed not to stand out in either direction. She completed tasks competently but without the excellence that might draw unwanted attention. Yet Webb seemed to sense something about her that irritated him. The breakthrough came during a combat training exercise in the third week. The recruits were learning basic self-defense techniques, and Webb was demonstrating submission holds. He called for volunteers to practice with, and his eyes inevitably settled on the recruits he enjoyed humiliating. When he called Sarah forward, she approached with the appropriate mix of nervousness and determination. Webb's demonstration was unnecessarily rough, his grip designed to cause discomfort rather than teach technique. As he applied a chokehold, Sarah had to actively resist the muscle memory that would have allowed her to escape and counterattack in less than 2 seconds. Instead, she struggled convincingly, tapping out at the appropriate moment. But Webb held the hold a few seconds longer than necessary, his message clear. When he finally released her, Sarah gasped for breath with theatrical desperation while her trained mind cataloged another violation for her growing file. That evening, as the recruits cleaned their gear and prepared for lights out, Rebecca approached Sarah with concern evident in her voice. The friendship that had developed between them felt genuine despite the deception underlying Sarah's presence, and she found herself genuinely caring about the young woman's welfare. Rebecca had noticed the pattern of harassment, and she wasn't alone. Several recruits had begun discussing their observations in hushed conversations after the instructors left for the day. They were beginning to realize that the treatment they were receiving went beyond standard military discipline. Sarah listened carefully to these conversations, gathering names and specific incidents. The pattern was worse than the initial intelligence had suggested. Webb wasn't working alone, and the abuse wasn't limited to psychological intimidation. Some recruits reported being denied adequate food, forced to perform dangerous exercises without proper safety protocols, and subjected to punishments that violated military regulations. The most disturbing revelation came from Amanda Rodriguez, who confided to Sarah and Rebecca that Webb had made inappropriate sexual comments during a private counseling session. Amanda was terrified to report the incident, convinced that it would result in her dismissal from the program and the loss of her only escape from her family situation. Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These weren't just abstract violations to be documented and reported through proper channels. These were real people suffering real harm while she maintained her cover. The conflict between her mission parameters and her moral obligations was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. The fourth week brought an escalation that pushed several recruits to their breaking points. Webb had recruited 2 other instructors to his campaign of systematic harassment, creating a coordinated effort to break down specific targets. The additional pressure was devastating for recruits who were already struggling with the legitimate challenges of military training. During a particularly brutal exercise session, Webb forced Amanda to repeat an obstacle course until she collapsed from exhaustion. When Rebecca attempted to help her friend, she was subjected to verbal abuse that reduced her to tears. Sarah watched from her position in formation, her hands clenched into fists as she fought every instinct that screamed for her to act. That night, Amanda made the decision that several recruits before her had made. She would quit the program rather than endure another day of Webb's treatment. Her departure would be processed as a failure to adapt to military life, with no investigation into the circumstances that had driven her to that choice. Sarah lay in her bunk that night, staring at the ceiling as she weighed her options. She had gathered substantial evidence of systematic abuse, enough to build a strong case against Webb and his collaborators. But continuing the investigation would mean allowing more recruits to suffer while she maintained her cover. The decision was taken out of her hands the following morning. During physical training, Webb selected Rebecca for a demonstration that went far beyond appropriate bounds. Using the excuse of teaching proper stance and grip, he subjected her to unnecessary physical contact while making comments that left no doubt about his intentions. Sarah felt something snap inside her as she watched her young friend's humiliation. The careful control she had maintained for weeks began to crack, as Webb's behavior crossed lines that even her mission parameters couldn't justify tolerating. When Webb called for another volunteer to continue his Demonstration. Sarah found herself stepping forward without conscious decision. The instructor's eyes lit up with anticipation as he recognized an opportunity to break down another recruit who had shown troubling signs of independence. As Webb approached her with the same predatory confidence he had displayed with Rebecca, Sarah made a split-second calculation. She could maintain her cover and endure his abuse, or she could begin the process of revealing enough of her true capabilities to protect her fellow recruits. The choice was easier than she had expected. Some things were more important than mission success, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves had always been her highest priority. Webb was about to discover that his newest target wasn't quite what she appeared to be. As the instructor reached for her with the same inappropriate familiarity he had shown Rebecca, Sarah began to move. Her response would be measured and controlled, revealing just enough of her training to establish a new dynamic without completely compromising her cover. Webb was about to learn that underestimating people based on appearances could be a very dangerous mistake. The quiet recruit he had been tormenting for weeks was about to show him exactly how dangerous that mistake could be. The moment Webb's hands made contact, Sarah's muscle memory activated with surgical precision. Years of combat training had taught her to assess threats and respond with exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize them. In this case, that meant demonstrating her capabilities without revealing their full extent. Webb's confident smirk disappeared as Sarah smoothly stepped aside from his grab. Her movement so fluid it appeared almost accidental. When he adjusted his approach and tried again, she shifted her weight in a way that left him off balance and grasping at empty air. To the observing recruits, it looked like nervous fidgeting. To anyone with combat training, it was clearly something else entirely. The third time Webb reached for her, Sarah allowed the contact, but immediately applied a counter-pressure that locked his wrist in place. Her grip was gentle enough to avoid injury, but firm enough to make her point. Webb found himself unable to move without experiencing significant discomfort, trapped by a hold he didn't understand and couldn't escape. For a moment, the training ground fell silent. The other recruits watched with wide eyes as their tormentors struggled against a grip applied by someone he had dismissed as weak and intimidated. Sarah maintained eye contact with Webb, while speaking in a voice that carried clearly across the assembled group. The words she chose were carefully calculated to establish new boundaries without revealing too much about her background. She explained that she had learned some self-defense techniques from her older brother, a story that would account for her surprising competence without suggesting professional training. Her tone remained respectful but carried an underlying steel that suggested she was no longer willing to tolerate inappropriate behavior. Webb's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger as he realized his authority had been challenged in front of the recruits. When Sarah finally released his wrist, he rubbed it unconsciously while glaring at her with undisguised hatred. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone present understood that something fundamental had changed. The immediate aftermath was tense but professionally handled. Webb completed the training session without further incident, though his demonstrations became notably more appropriate when Sarah was involved. The other recruits looked at her with new respect and curiosity, wondering what else their quiet bunkmate might be hiding. Rebecca was the first to approach Sarah after the session ended. Her friend's eyes were bright with gratitude and amazement as she peppered Sarah with questions about her self-defense training. Sarah deflected most of the inquiries while providing just enough detail to satisfy curiosity without creating inconsistencies in her cover story. The ripple effects of the confrontation spread quickly through the recruit population. Word traveled that one of their own had stood up to Webb's harassment and emerged victorious. For many who had felt helpless against the systematic abuse, Sarah's actions provided hope that resistance was possible. Webb's response came within hours. Unable to directly retaliate against Sarah without acknowledging that she had bested him, he instead intensified his harassment of other recruits. His behavior became increasingly erratic as he struggled to reassert his dominance over a group that was beginning to question his authority. Sarah found herself in an increasingly difficult position. Her demonstration had been intended to protect Rebecca and establish boundaries, but it had also marked her as a threat in Webb's eyes. Every day brought new challenges as the instructor sought opportunities to break her down and reassert his control. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and relentless. Webb arranged for Sarah to receive conflicting orders from different instructors, setting her up to fail no matter which directive she followed. Her equipment was sabotaged in subtle ways that would appear to be her own negligence. Training exercises were modified to isolate her from support and assistance. Through it all, Sarah maintained her cover while documenting every violation. Her real mission required gathering evidence that would stand up in a formal investigation, and Webb's escalating behavior was providing exactly the kind of documentation needed. Each incident was carefully recorded in her memory, complete with witnesses and specific details that could be verified later. The other recruits began to coalesce around Sarah's quiet leadership. She found herself becoming an unofficial spokesperson for their grievances, though she was careful not to assume a role that would draw too much attention to her capabilities. Instead, she encouraged others to document incidents and support each other through the systematic harassment they were all experiencing. Rebecca proved to be particularly valuable as an ally and cover for Sarah's activities. The young woman's genuine enthusiasm for military service provided a perfect contrast to Sarah's more measured approach, and their friendship gave Sarah access to information about incidents she hadn't witnessed personally. One particularly disturbing revelation came from a recruit named David Park, a quiet young man from Oregon who had joined to serve his country and support his family. David confided to Sarah and Rebecca that Webb had threatened to have him discharged for psychological unfitness unless he provided detailed information about his fellow recruits' private conversations and personal struggles. The request put David in an impossible position. Complying with Webb's demand would betray his friends and potentially expose them to further harassment. Refusing might result in his dismissal from the program and the loss of the career he desperately needed. Sarah recognized the tactic as a classic example of coercive manipulation, designed to turn the recruits against each other while giving Webb ammunition for future abuse. Sarah's response was carefully calculated to provide support without revealing her professional knowledge of such tactics. She suggested that David document Webb's request in writing, presenting it as common sense rather than trained intelligence gathering. She also arranged for other recruits to witness conversations that would corroborate David's account if formal charges were ever filed. The situation reached a critical point during the 6th week of training. Webb's behavior had become so erratic that even other instructors were beginning to take notice. His obsession with breaking Sarah down had begun to interfere with the legitimate training objectives, and complaints from other staff members were reaching the attention of senior leadership. Rather than moderate his approach, Webb chose to escalate. During a night navigation exercise, he arranged for Sarah to be separated from her group and placed in a potentially dangerous situation. The scenario was designed to appear accidental while creating an opportunity for him to isolate and intimidate her away from witnesses. Sarah recognized the setup immediately. Her years of combat experience had taught her to identify tactical disadvantages and respond appropriately. When Webb appeared in the training area where she had been deliberately isolated, she was ready for whatever he had planned. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything the training facility had ever experienced. Webb's attempts at psychological intimidation met with calm resistance that clearly frustrated him. When he escalated to physical intimidation, Sarah's responses revealed just enough of her training to make it clear that she was far more dangerous than he had assumed. The turning point came when Webb made a critical error in judgment. Convinced that he could break Sarah through fear and isolation, he made threats that crossed legal boundaries. His words were recorded by equipment Sarah had been carrying as part of her undercover investigation, providing irrefutable evidence of his criminal behavior. When Webb realized that his threats had been documented, his demeanor changed from predatory confidence to desperate panic. He attempted to destroy the recording equipment, not knowing that Sarah had backup systems in place. His violent reaction provided additional evidence of consciousness of guilt while demonstrating the lengths he would go to protect himself. Sarah's response was measured and professional. She subdued Webb using minimal force, applying restraints with the practiced efficiency of someone trained in military police procedures. Her actions were proportionate to the threat he posed, while ensuring that evidence was preserved and his safety was maintained. The aftermath of the incident moved quickly through official channels. Senior leadership responded to Sarah's emergency communication with immediate action, dispatching military police and launching a formal investigation. Webb was placed under arrest pending a full review of his conduct, while other implicated instructors were suspended from duty. Sarah's cover was partially blown by the incident, but in a way that enhanced rather than compromised her mission. Her identity as an experienced military police investigator provided a credible explanation for her capabilities, without revealing her true background as a Navy SEAL. The recruits understood that they had been protected by someone with special training, though they didn't know the full extent of her qualifications. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Sarah's documented evidence, combined with testimony from the recruits who had suffered under Webb's harassment, built an overwhelming case against the corrupt instructors. The systematic nature of the abuse became clear as patterns emerged from multiple independent accounts. Rebecca and the other recruits found themselves at the center of a media storm as news of the investigation became public. Military leadership moved quickly to address the systemic issues that had allowed such abuse to flourish, implementing new oversight procedures and support systems for future recruits. For Sarah, the successful completion of her mission brought mixed emotions. The evidence she had gathered would prevent future recruits from suffering under Webb's harassment, and the corrupt instructors would face appropriate consequences for their actions. But the cost had been measured in the suffering of innocent young people who had trusted the military to treat them with dignity and respect. As the formal investigation concluded and Sarah prepared to return to her regular duties, she reflected on the lessons learned from her time undercover. The experience had reminded her why she had originally chosen to serve, and why protecting those who couldn't protect themselves remained her highest priority. The recruits she had served with would go on to complete their training under new leadership, carrying with them the knowledge that someone had been willing to stand up for them when they needed it most. For Sarah, that knowledge made every risk and sacrifice worthwhile. The days following Webb's arrest brought an unexpected calm to the training facility. Sarah watched as the atmosphere among the recruits shifted from fear and tension to cautious optimism. New instructors arrived to replace those who had been suspended, bringing with them a commitment to proper training methods and respect for the recruits under their command. However, Sarah's mission was far from complete. The preliminary investigation had revealed that the corruption extended beyond Webb and his immediate collaborators. Anonymous reports were surfacing about similar incidents at other training facilities, suggesting a broader pattern of systemic abuse that required continued investigation. Admiral Catherine Reeves, the commanding officer overseeing Sarah's undercover operation, arrived at the facility for a classified briefing 3 days after Webb's arrest. The meeting took place in a secure conference room, away from the prying eyes and ears of those who might still be involved in the corruption they were investigating. Sarah's report was comprehensive and damning. The evidence she had gathered painted a picture of institutionalized harassment that had been allowed to flourish under inadequate oversight. Webb had been enabled by a network of instructors and administrators who had either participated directly in the abuse or turned a blind eye to protect their own careers. The Admiral listened intently as Sarah detailed each incident, reviewing the documentation and witness statements that would form the foundation of formal charges. The scope of the investigation would need to be expanded significantly, requiring coordination between multiple commands and potentially involving civilian law enforcement agencies. What concerned Admiral Reeves most was the psychological profile that emerged from Sarah's observations. Webb and his collaborators had specifically targeted recruits they perceived as vulnerable or different. Women, minorities, and those from disadvantaged backgrounds had borne the brunt of the systematic harassment, creating an environment that undermined the military's stated commitment to equality and opportunity. The conversation turned to Sarah's next assignment. Her cover as an investigator had been partially blown, but her identity as a Navy SEAL remained secret. This unique position allowed her to continue gathering intelligence while operating in a semi-official capacity that would give her greater access to restricted areas and classified information. Admiral Reeves had received reports of similar problems at Naval Station Norfolk, where a new class of recruits was scheduled to begin training the following month. The facility had a reputation for excellence, but recent anonymous complaints suggested that reputation might be masking serious problems. Sarah would be transferred there as a junior instructor, a position that would allow her to observe training methods from inside the command structure. The assignment represented a significant escalation in responsibility and risk. As an instructor, Sarah would have direct authority over recruits while simultaneously gathering evidence against potentially corrupt colleagues. The balance between maintaining her cover and protecting vulnerable trainees would be even more delicate than it had been during her time as a recruit. Before departing for Norfolk, Sarah spent several days with the recruits who had survived Webb's harassment. The bonds formed during their shared ordeal had created a tight-knit group that looked to her for guidance and support. Rebecca, in particular, had become something of a younger sister to Sarah, and saying goodbye was more difficult than she had anticipated. The young woman from California had grown tremendously during her time in training. The confidence that Webb had tried so hard to destroy had returned stronger than ever, tempered by the knowledge that she could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Rebecca's transformation from an enthusiastic but naive recruit to a capable and determined sailor represented everything that military training should achieve. David Park had also emerged from the experience as a stronger person. The quiet young man from Oregon had found his voice during the investigation, providing crucial testimony that had helped establish the pattern of abuse. His decision to stand up against Webb's coercive demands had been a turning point not just for the investigation, but for his own personal development. Amanda Rodriguez had chosen to continue with her training despite the trauma she had experienced. Her decision to stay and complete the program required tremendous courage, especially given her background of abuse and vulnerability. Sarah made sure that Amanda had access to appropriate counseling and support services, understanding that healing from psychological trauma required professional assistance. The journey to Norfolk provided Sarah with time to reflect on the complexities of her dual role. As a Navy SEAL, she was accustomed to clear objectives and defined enemies. The undercover investigation required her to operate in shades of gray, balancing competing loyalties and managing relationships that were built on necessary deceptions. Her new identity as Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Williams, instructor, required another shift in persona. She would need to project authority and competence while remaining approachable to recruits who might need to confide in her about inappropriate treatment. The role demanded a careful balance of strength and empathy that would test her acting abilities to their limits. Naval Station Norfolk was significantly larger and more complex than the facility where she had completed her initial undercover assignment. The training command oversaw multiple programs simultaneously, creating opportunities for misconduct to hide within the bureaucratic maze of overlapping jurisdictions and competing priorities. Sarah's first week as an instructor was devoted to orientation and observation. She attended briefings with senior staff, reviewed training protocols, and began to understand the culture that existed within the command structure. On the surface, everything appeared professional and well-organized. The real test would come when she began working directly with recruits and observing how training was conducted away from official oversight. Her first class assignment was a group of 30 recruits beginning their second week of basic training. The mix of backgrounds and personalities was similar to what she had experienced as a recruit herself, with the same combination of enthusiasm, nervousness, and determination that characterized young people taking their first steps into military service. The lead instructor for her section was Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, a career sailor with 15 years of experience and a reputation for producing highly qualified graduates. Chief Santos appeared to be everything that Webb was not: professional, fair, and genuinely committed to developing the potential of every recruit under her command. However, Sarah's trained eye noticed subtle signs that suggested not everything was as it appeared. Certain recruits seemed more nervous than others when interacting with specific instructors. Comments made during informal conversations hinted at incidents that weren't being officially reported. The pattern was more subtle than what she had observed with Webb, but the underlying indicators were disturbingly familiar. Sarah's investigation techniques had been refined by her previous experience. She established herself as a supportive presence for recruits while carefully documenting anything that seemed inappropriate or unprofessional. Her position as an instructor gave her access to personnel files, training records, and communication systems that would allow her to identify patterns that might not be visible from a recruit's perspective. The breakthrough came during her third week at Norfolk. A recruit named Jennifer Walsh approached Sarah after hours, clearly distressed about something she was reluctant to discuss. Jennifer was a college graduate from Massachusetts who had enlisted after struggling to find meaningful employment in her chosen field. Her academic background and leadership potential had marked her as a strong candidate for advanced training programs. Jennifer's story unfolded slowly, as Sarah used her training in investigative interviewing to create a safe space for disclosure. The young woman described a pattern of inappropriate behavior by one of the senior instructors, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes. The incidents began with seemingly innocent comments about her appearance and physical fitness, but had escalated to unwanted physical contact and sexually suggestive conversations. What made the situation particularly insidious was Hayes's position within the command structure. As a commissioned officer with influence over training assignments and evaluations, he had significant power over the recruits' future careers. Jennifer was terrified that reporting his behavior would result in retaliation that could destroy her chances of military success. Sarah's response was carefully calibrated to provide support while gathering the information needed for a formal investigation. She encouraged Jennifer to document future incidents, while assuring her that appropriate protections existed for those who reported misconduct. More importantly, she began developing a plan to gather independent evidence that would support Jennifer's allegations. The investigation required Sarah to expand her surveillance activities beyond simple observation. Using her security clearance and access to restricted areas, she was able to review communication logs, training schedules, and personnel records that revealed patterns consistent with Jennifer's account. Hayes had a history of requesting specific assignments that gave him unsupervised access to female recruits, and his performance evaluations showed unexplained variations that correlated with complaints that had been informally resolved. The challenge was gathering direct evidence of misconduct without compromising Jennifer's safety or revealing Sarah's true mission. Hayes was more sophisticated than Webb had been, carefully avoiding behavior that would leave obvious evidence while maintaining plausible deniability for his actions. The investigation would require patience and careful planning to build a case that could withstand legal scrutiny. Sarah's position as an instructor provided opportunities to observe Hayes in action while appearing to be conducting normal duties. She arranged to be present during training sessions where Hayes interacted with female recruits, documenting his behavior through carefully maintained logs that would be admissible as evidence. The pattern that emerged was clear but subtle. Hayes used his authority to create situations where he could isolate vulnerable recruits, then gradually escalated inappropriate behavior, while making it clear that resistance would have negative consequences for their military careers. His victims were chosen specifically for their ambition and potential, making them reluctant to risk their futures by filing formal complaints. As Sarah gathered evidence, she also began identifying other potential victims. Hayes's pattern of behavior suggested that Jennifer was not his first target, and careful investigation revealed several other recruits who had experienced similar harassment. The scope of the misconduct was broader than initially suspected, requiring a more comprehensive approach to the investigation. The turning point came when Sarah witnessed Hayes's behavior firsthand during a late-night training exercise. Using her position to monitor the activity, she observed him isolate Jennifer from the group and engage in behavior that was clearly inappropriate and unprofessional. The incident provided the direct evidence needed to move forward with formal charges while ensuring that Hayes could not retaliate against his victims. Sarah's documentation of the incident was meticulous and comprehensive. Her report included not only her direct observations, but also supporting evidence from communication logs, training records, and witness statements that established the pattern of misconduct. The case she built would be strong enough to ensure prosecution while protecting the victims from retaliation. The investigation's conclusion brought both satisfaction and frustration. Hayes was arrested and faced both military and civilian charges for his conduct, while systemic changes were implemented to prevent similar abuse in the future. The victims received appropriate support and counseling, and their military careers were protected from retaliation. However, Sarah was increasingly aware that the problem she was uncovering represented something larger than individual corruption. The pattern of abuse at multiple facilities suggested institutional failures that would require fundamental changes to military culture and oversight systems. Her mission was evolving from investigating specific incidents to documenting a crisis that threatened the integrity of military training programs nationwide. The arrest of Lieutenant Commander Hayes sent shockwaves through Naval Station Norfolk that extended far beyond the training command. Senior leadership realized they were facing a crisis that threatened the credibility of the entire military training system. Admiral Reeves convened an emergency meeting with Sarah and other key investigators to assess the scope of the problem and develop a comprehensive response strategy. The evidence Sarah had gathered revealed connections between the Norfolk incident and similar cases at facilities across the country. Hayes had previously served at 2 other training installations where complaints had been filed and quietly resolved without formal investigation. The pattern suggested a systematic failure to address misconduct that had allowed predatory behavior to flourish under official protection. Sarah's role in the investigation was becoming increasingly complex. Her success in uncovering corruption had established her as a valuable asset for rooting out institutional problems, but it had also made her a target for those who had benefited from the existing system. Maintaining her cover while operating at higher levels of the command structure required new strategies and greater operational security. The decision was made to expand Sarah's mission beyond individual cases, to investigate the institutional structures that enabled abuse. Her new assignment would take her to the Pentagon, where she would work as part of a classified task force examining training protocols and oversight procedures across all military branches. The position would give her access to data and personnel files that could reveal the true scope of the corruption problem. Before leaving Norfolk, Sarah met with Jennifer Walsh and the other recruits who had been victimized by Hayes. The young woman had grown tremendously during the investigation, developing the confidence and strength that would serve her well in her military career. Jennifer's courage in coming forward had been instrumental in building the case against Hayes, and her willingness to testify would ensure that justice was served. The conversation was emotional for both women. Sarah had been forced to maintain professional distance throughout the investigation, unable to reveal her true feelings about the abuse she had witnessed. Now, with the case concluded and her departure imminent, she could finally express her admiration for Jennifer's courage and her commitment to ensuring that other recruits would be protected from similar harm. Jennifer's response surprised Sarah with its maturity and insight. The young recruit understood that her experience, while traumatic, had prepared her for challenges she might face throughout her military career. She expressed gratitude not just for Sarah's support, but for the example of strength and integrity she had provided during the darkest moments of the investigation. The Pentagon assignment represented a significant escalation in both responsibility and risk. Sarah would be working directly with senior leadership who had the power to either support meaningful reform or suppress investigations that threatened their own interests. The political complexity of the environment would require her to navigate carefully between competing agendas while maintaining focus on her primary mission of protecting service members. Her new cover identity as a personnel analyst gave her legitimate access to training records, disciplinary files, and performance evaluations from facilities nationwide. The data revealed patterns that were both disturbing and illuminating, showing how systemic problems had been masked by administrative procedures that prioritized institutional reputation over individual welfare. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Sarah's analysis revealed hundreds of cases where complaints had been filed, investigated, and resolved through administrative channels that protected perpetrators while silencing victims. The pattern extended beyond sexual harassment to include financial corruption, training fraud, and abuse of authority that had undermined military readiness and morale for years. Working with a small team of trusted investigators, Sarah began building a comprehensive case that documented not just individual instances of misconduct, but the institutional failures that had allowed such behavior to flourish. The investigation required coordination with multiple agencies and careful management of classified information that could compromise ongoing operations. The breakthrough came when Sarah identified a network of senior officers who had been systematically protecting each other from investigation while advancing their careers through mutual support. The conspiracy involved personnel assignments, performance evaluations, and disciplinary actions that had created a culture of impunity for those within the protected circle. The evidence was overwhelming, but acting on it required careful coordination with senior leadership who had not been compromised by the corruption. Admiral Reeves worked with Sarah to develop a strategy that would allow them to move against the conspiracy without alerting those who were under investigation or compromising the safety of potential witnesses. The operation that followed was the largest corruption investigation in modern military history. Simultaneous arrests were coordinated across multiple installations, with investigators moving quickly to secure evidence and protect witnesses. Sarah's role in coordinating the operation drew on all of her SEAL training, as she managed complex logistics while maintaining operational security under intense pressure. The immediate aftermath was chaotic but ultimately successful. Dozens of senior officers were arrested on charges ranging from sexual assault to financial fraud. The evidence Sarah had helped gather ensured that the cases would result in convictions, while the systematic nature of the corruption made it impossible for the military to minimize the significance of the scandal. More importantly, the investigation led to fundamental reforms in military training and oversight systems. New protocols were established for reporting and investigating misconduct, with independent oversight mechanisms that would make it much more difficult for corruption to take root in the future. The changes represented a victory not just for the individual victims who had suffered abuse, but for the integrity of the military as an institution. Sarah's undercover work concluded with her return to active SEAL operations, but the experience had changed her perspective on military service in profound ways. She had seen both the worst and best of military culture, from the predatory behavior of those who abused their authority to the courage of young recruits who risked their careers to expose wrongdoing. The relationships formed during her undercover assignments remained important to her. Rebecca Chen had graduated from training and was serving with distinction as a communications specialist. Her enthusiasm for military service had survived Webb's harassment, tempered by experience but undiminished in its sincerity. David Park had been selected for advanced training in cybersecurity, his quiet competence and integrity making him an ideal candidate for sensitive assignments. Jennifer Walsh had exceeded all expectations during her military career, rising quickly through the ranks while becoming an advocate for military women who faced harassment and discrimination. Her experience with Hayes had given her insight into institutional problems, while her collaboration with Sarah had shown her how individuals could make a difference even within large bureaucratic systems. The systemic reforms implemented as a result of Sarah's investigation had measurable impact on military culture. Reports of harassment and abuse declined significantly as new oversight mechanisms made misconduct more difficult to hide and more costly to perpetrate. Training programs were redesigned to emphasize respect and professionalism while maintaining the high standards necessary for military readiness. Sarah's success in the undercover investigation led to new assignments that drew on her unique combination of combat experience and investigative skills. She became part of an elite unit within the SEAL community that specialized in complex operations requiring deep cover and sophisticated intelligence gathering. The work was challenging and often dangerous, but it provided opportunities to protect vulnerable populations while serving broader national security interests. The lessons learned from her time as an undercover investigator influenced Sarah's approach to all subsequent assignments. She had seen how institutional failures could undermine even the most dedicated individuals, and how courage and integrity could triumph over corruption when supported by proper systems and leadership. The experience had reinforced her commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves while serving the broader mission of national defense. Years later, when Sarah reflected on her undercover investigation, she measured its success not just in terms of arrests and convictions, but in the lives that had been saved and careers that had been protected. Young men and women entering military service would benefit from reforms that had been purchased with the courage of those who had been willing to speak truth to power when doing so required tremendous personal risk. The investigation had also demonstrated the importance of having people within institutions who were willing to challenge corruption regardless of personal cost. Sarah's unique position as a highly trained operative with unquestionable credentials had allowed her to gather evidence and build cases that others could not have developed. Her success proved the value of using unconventional approaches to address institutional problems. Most importantly, the experience had shown that individual actions could have systemic impact when properly coordinated and supported. The recruits who had trusted Sarah with their stories, the witnesses who had been willing to testify despite personal risk, and the senior leaders who had supported reform despite political pressure, had all contributed to changes that would benefit future generations of service members. As Sarah returned to her primary role as a Navy SEAL, she carried with her the knowledge that protecting democracy required vigilance, not just against external threats, but against the corruption that could undermine institutions from within. Her undercover investigation had been successful, not because she had been willing to risk her career for others, but because she had understood that some missions were more important than individual advancement. The young recruits who had once mocked her apparent low rank had learned valuable lessons about the dangers of judging people by appearances. More importantly, they had seen firsthand how someone with real strength used that strength to protect others rather than to dominate or intimidate. The example Sarah had set during her time undercover would influence their own leadership styles throughout their military careers. The investigation's conclusion marked not an ending, but a transformation in how the military approached training and oversight. Sarah's work had contributed to institutional changes that would protect future generations of service members while maintaining the high standards necessary for national defense. The mission had been successful because it had balanced individual justice with systemic reform, ensuring that the courage of those who had spoken out would result in lasting change.